The torches flickered in the winter wind, casting dancing shadows across the timber walls of the Roman military fortress at Carnuntum. Outside, the Danube River flowed dark and cold, beneath a sky heavy with clouds that threatened snow. Inside a small room in the commander's quarters, a man sat hunched over a writing desk, his fingers stiff from cold despite the brazier burning nearby. He wore a simple tunic, not the purple regalia of imperial power. His face, lined with fatigue and illness, was illuminated by the wavering lamplight as he dipped his stylus into ink and began to write. The year was 172. The place was a military encampment on the edge of the known world, where civilization met, the vast forests and plains of Barbaricum, and the man was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, Emperor of Rome, commander of one of the largest concentrations of military force ever assembled on a Roman frontier, ruler of an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. He was perhaps the most powerful human being alive, and he was utterly, desperately exhausted. This is the story of what happened during those long winters at the Danube frontier, not a story of military triumph or political maneuvering, not a story when empires rose or fell in a single moment, but a story of how, through persistent practice and the discipline of writing, a man burdened beyond what most of us can imagine found something that had eluded him for years. He found peace. Not the peace of victory or the peace of safety, not the peace that comes from circumstance finally aligning with desire, but a different kind of peace altogether, the kind that emerges when you stop fighting what cannot be changed and start living according to what is, the kind of peace that a philosophy called Stoicism had promised him since childhood, but which had remained maddeningly out of reach through years of plague, war, betrayal, and loss. To understand what happened that night, we need to go back before the wars, before the throne, before the weight of empire settled on shoulders that were never meant to carry it. We need to understand who this man was, how he got here, and what it cost him to finally, in the darkness of a winter campaign, discover what he'd been seeking all along. The empire Marcus inherited was vast, but it was also fragile in ways that only he could see. For decades, Rome had enjoyed what historians call the Pax Romana, a period of relative peace and prosperity. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The economy was stretched thin by continuous military expenditures. The plague that had swept through the empire in 165 had killed millions, devastating the tax base and the military's recruiting pool. The Germanic tribes beyond the Danube, pressed by migrations from the north and east, were no longer content to remain in their forests. They wanted the rich farmlands of Pannonia and Noricum. Some wanted to settle peacefully, others wanted to take what they could by force. And into this brewing storm walked a young man who had never wanted to be emperor at all, who had wanted more than anything to be a philosopher, to sit in quiet rooms discussing virtue and wisdom, logic and physics, to live a simple life devoted to understanding the nature of things. Instead, duty called, and Marcus Aurelius, trained from childhood to never shirk his responsibilities, answered. He took up the purple. He took up the burden, and he carried it day after day, year after year, until his body broke and his spirit came close to breaking too. But on that winter night at Carnuntum, something shifted. In the quiet hours after the camp had settled, after the sentries had taken their posts, and the fires had burned down to embers, Marcus sat with his journal and his thoughts. And in the writing, in the practice of philosophical exercises that had become his nightly ritual, he found what he'd been searching for. Not happiness, not comfort, not relief, from his burdens, but acceptance, understanding, a way to carry what he had to carry without being crushed by the weight of it, a way to be at peace even in the middle of war. What he wrote that night, and on countless other nights during those long campaigns, would survive the collapse of the empire he served. It would outlive the military victories and the political achievements. It would speak to generation after generation of people facing their own wars, their own burdens, their own long dark nights when peace seemed impossible. The private journals of Marcus Aurelius, which we call the Meditations, have become one of the most influential works of practical philosophy ever written, not because they propose grand theories or construct elaborate systems, but because they show us, in raw and honest detail, how one man learned to find peace, not by changing his circumstances, but by changing his relationship to them. This is the story of that journey, of how an emperor became a philosopher, of how a man burdened with impossible responsibilities discovered that the one thing he could control, his own mind, was also the one thing that mattered most. Of how he learned, in the worst conditions imaginable, to stop demanding that the world be other than it is, and of how, in that acceptance, he found a peace that no external circumstance could ever give or take away. Let's begin where Marcus himself began, long before the wars, before the plague, before the weight of empire. Let's begin with a young boy in Rome who loved philosophy more than power, and who would spend his entire life trying to reconcile the demands of duty with the longing for wisdom. The emperor who never wanted the throne. Marcus Aurelius was born on April 26, 121, in Rome. His full name at birth was Marcus Annius Verus, and he came from a wealthy, influential family with deep connections to the imperial court. His grandfather had served as consul twice and was a close advisor to Emperor Hadrian. By all accounts, young Marcus should have lived the comfortable, privileged life of a Roman aristocrat, educated in rhetoric and law, perhaps serving in the Senate, managing vast estates, enjoying the pleasures that wealth and status could provide. But fate, in the eye of an emperor, had other plans. Hadrian noticed the boy early. There was something about him that caught the old emperor's attention. Perhaps it was his seriousness, his thoughtfulness, his commitment to truth-telling that earned him the nickname Verissimus, the most truthful one. At age 6, Marcus was inducted into the equestrian order. At 8, he was enrolled in the Salii, an ancient priestly college dedicated to Mars. These were honors, certainly, but they were also chains being forged, links connecting the boy to power and responsibility he had never sought. But it was the discovery of philosophy that truly shaped him. Around age 11 or 12, Marcus encountered the teachings of the Stoics through his tutors, particularly a man named Diognetus. The effect was immediate and profound. Here was a philosophy that spoke to something deep within him, not a religion promising divine rewards or threatening divine punishments, not a political ideology justifying power or wealth, but a practical system for living well, for finding tranquility amid chaos, for maintaining virtue regardless of circumstance. The Stoics taught that there was a rational order to the universe, that human beings were part of that order, and that happiness came from living in harmony with nature and reason, rather than being driven by passion and desire. Young Marcus threw himself into philosophical study with an intensity that worried his mother. He slept on a board covered with animal skins, rather than a comfortable bed, training himself in the Stoic virtue of simplicity. He wore rough clothing. He resisted the luxuries that were his birthright. This wasn't mere adolescent asceticism. It was training. Marcus understood, even then, that philosophy was not just a subject to study but a way of life to practice. That wisdom was not acquired through memorization, but through deliberate cultivation of virtue. When Marcus was 17, Emperor Hadrian died, having arranged for his succession with characteristic foresight. He had adopted Antoninus Pius as his heir, with the condition that Antoninus in turn adopt two young men, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. This complex arrangement was designed to ensure stability, to prevent the violence and chaos that had marked earlier imperial successions. It meant that Marcus, still a teenager, was now heir apparent to the most powerful position in the world. The quiet life of philosophical study he had imagined was slipping away, replaced by the demands of imperial duty. Under Antoninus Pius, Marcus learned what it meant to serve. Antoninus was a model emperor, modest, dutiful, devoted to the welfare of his people. He rarely left Italy. He avoided unnecessary wars. He administered the empire with steady competence rather than dramatic flair. For 23 years, he provided exactly the kind of stable, peaceful rule that allowed the empire to prosper. And for all those years, Marcus stood beside him, learning, observing, preparing for a role he still did not want. In his meditations, Marcus would later devote an entire section to expressing gratitude for what he learned from those around him, including Antoninus. He learned patience. He learned to listen to advice. He learned that true power came not from imposing one's will, but from service to something greater than oneself. He learned that a ruler could be both firm and compassionate, both decisive and humble. These were lessons that would sustain him through trials that Antoninus himself never faced. But he also continued his philosophical education. He studied with the best Stoic teachers of his generation. He read the works of Epictetus, a former slave who had become one of the most profound Stoic thinkers. From Epictetus, Marcus learned that we don't control what happens to us, but we do control how we respond. That our judgments about events, not the events themselves, cause our suffering. That freedom comes from wanting what we have rather than having what we want. These ideas, which might sound simple or even trite, would prove to be life-preserving wisdom in the years to come. In March of 161, Antoninus Pius died. Marcus, now 40 years old, became emperor. Immediately, against all precedent, he insisted on sharing power equally with Lucius Verus, the other young man Hadrian had designated. This was not weakness. This was philosophy in action. Marcus believed in the Stoic principle of ruling for the common good, not personal glory. He believed that shared power would make for better governance. He believed, perhaps naively, that virtue and wisdom would triumph over the lust for individual power. If Marcus had harbored any hopes that his reign would be peaceful, that he could be a philosopher king in the manner Plato had imagined, ruling with wisdom in a time of prosperity, those hopes were shattered almost immediately. The Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival in the East, chose the transition of power as an opportunity to test the new emperor. They invaded Armenia, a crucial buffer state between the two empires. A war that would last 5 years was beginning, and that war would bring back something far more deadly than enemy soldiers. The Parthian War was, by most measures, a Roman victory. Lucius Verus was sent east to command, though the actual military work was done by capable generals like Avidius Cassius. Roman legions drove deep into Parthian territory, capturing cities, restoring Armenia to Rome's sphere of influence. But the returning troops brought with them the seeds of catastrophe. They carried a plague, possibly smallpox or measles, that would come to be called the Antonine Plague. It swept through the empire like fire through dry grass. Estimates suggest it killed between 5 and 10 million people over the next 2 decades. In some areas, as much as a third of the population died. The military was devastated. The economy collapsed in many regions. The tax base that supported the empire shrank dramatically, and everywhere, in every city and town and village, there was death. Marcus watched his world fall apart. The plague killed his co-emperor and adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, in 169. It killed countless friends and advisors. It may have infected Marcus himself, though he recovered. But far worse than his own suffering was the knowledge that he was responsible for all those who were dying. As emperor, it fell to him to organize relief efforts, to fund funerals for the poor, to keep the government functioning even as entire departments lost their staff. He sold off imperial possessions to raise money. He auctioned treasures from the palace, including his wife's jewelry and robes, to pay for plague response. He recruited gladiators and slaves to bolster the decimated legions, a move that shocked the aristocracy but kept the borders defended. And then, as if plague were not enough, the northern frontier erupted. The Germanic tribes, the Marcomanni and Quadi and others, saw Rome's weakness. They saw legions depleted by disease. They saw a new emperor who preferred philosophy to warfare, and they attacked. The exact timing is debated by historians, but by 170 at the latest, they had crossed the Danube in massive numbers. They pushed through Noricum into Italy itself, besieging the city of Aquileia. It was the first time since the Cimbri invasion of 101 BC that hostile forces had reached Italian soil. Rome panicked. Marcus had to act. The philosopher had to become a general. The man who wanted to spend his days in quiet contemplation had to spend them planning military campaigns. In 170, at the age of 49, Marcus Aurelius marched north to the Danube frontier. He would spend the next decade of his life there, with brief returns to Rome. He would live in military camps. He would endure the cold of Central European winters and the heat of summer campaigns. He would watch men die, both from enemy action and from the plague that continued to ravage the army. He would make the brutal calculations of war, trading lives for strategic advantage, knowing that every decision meant death for someone, and through it all, he would try to remain a philosopher, to practice virtue, to find some way to reconcile what he believed with what he had to do. This was the man who sat in that room at Carnuntum, writing by lamplight, an emperor who had never wanted to be emperor, a philosopher forced to be a warrior, a man trying to find peace in a world that gave him none. And the war, which had already dragged on for years, was nowhere close to ending. The disasters were piling up, and Marcus was running out of strength to carry them, when disaster compounds disaster. The Battle of Carnuntum was a catastrophe, though historians debate whether it occurred in 167 or 170. Roman sources are frustratingly vague about the details, as they often are when describing defeats. But the outline is clear enough. A Roman force, perhaps 20,000 strong, met a combined army of Marcomanni and Quadi, led by King Balomar, near the legionary fortress of Carnuntum in Upper Pannonia. The legions were inexperienced, many of them recently recruited to replace plague losses. The Germanic warriors were seasoned, desperate, and likely outnumbered the Romans. What followed was a slaughter. Ancient sources claim 20,000 Romans were killed. The entire force was effectively destroyed. This opened the door to Italy. The Marcomanni and their allies poured south through the Alpine passes. They besieged Aquileia, one of Rome's most prosperous cities, and razed the town of Operturgium to the ground. Praetorian prefect Furius Victorinus attempted to relieve Aquileia and was defeated and possibly killed. Rome itself, for the first time in centuries, faced the possibility of invasion. Panic spread through the streets. People fled with what they could carry. The Senate demanded action. Marcus responded with everything he had. He pulled troops from other frontiers, weakening defenses against Parthia and in Britain, gambling that those threats could wait. He appointed Tiberius Claudius Pompeianus, his son-in-law, as supreme commander. He created a new defensive zone, the Praetentura Italiae et Alpium, to protect northern Italy. He strengthened the Danube fleet, and slowly, at tremendous cost, the tide began to turn. By late 171, the invaders had been expelled from Roman territory. Aquileia was relieved. The immediate crisis had passed. But Marcus knew this was only a breathing space. The Germanic tribes were not going to disappear. They were being pushed south by migrations from Scandinavia and northern Germania. They needed land, they needed resources, and they would keep coming until Rome either found a way to accommodate them or destroyed them utterly. Neither option was acceptable, so there would be more war, more campaigns, more years away from Rome, living in military camps on the frontier. In 172, Marcus launched a counter-offensive across the Danube into Marcomannic territory. This was not a punitive raid, but a strategic campaign designed to break the power of the tribal confederation permanently. Roman legions, supported by auxiliary troops and cavalry, marched into what is now the Czech Republic and Slovakia. They fought in thick forests and across frozen rivers. They burned villages and destroyed food supplies, trying to starve the enemy into submission. It was brutal, dirty, exhausting work. Not the glorious battles celebrated in triumphal processions, but the grinding reality of warfare, where victory comes through superior logistics and the willingness to endure hardship longer than your enemy. Marcus was there, not just nominally as emperor, but physically present with the army. He crossed the Danube with his troops. He lived in the same conditions they lived in. He shared their dangers, if not their frontline combat. This was unusual for an emperor and showed both his commitment to duty and his understanding that he could not ask his soldiers to endure what he himself would not face. But it took a terrible toll. The cold aggravated his chronic health problems. Ancient sources suggest he suffered from some form of ulcer or stomach ailment that caused him constant pain. The stress of command, the knowledge that every mistake cost lives, the weight of responsibility for an entire empire, all of this wore on him, and the personal losses kept mounting. Marcus had been married to Faustina the Younger since 145. By all accounts, including his own words in the Meditations, he loved her deeply. She had borne him at least 13 children, though sources vary on the exact number. Most of those children died in infancy or early childhood, a common tragedy in the ancient world, but no less devastating for being common. Marcus watched child after child sicken and die. He watched Faustina's health decline from the strain of repeated pregnancies and childbirths. And in 175, while he was still on campaign, she died. Some sources say it was in childbirth. Others suggest illness, possibly the plague. Marcus was devastated, but he could not afford to grieve openly. He had to maintain the stoic composure expected of an emperor. He had to continue the war. So he buried his grief in duty and in the practice of philosophy. There was also the betrayal, or what might have been betrayal. In 175, word reached Marcus that Avidius Cassius, the successful general who had won the Parthian War, had declared himself emperor. Cassius controlled Egypt and Syria, critical provinces that supplied much of Rome's grain. If he consolidated power in the east while Marcus was tied down in the north, the empire could split in two. Marcus had to respond. He broke off the Germanic campaign and marched east with his army, preparing for civil war. But before he could engage Cassius, the rebel general was assassinated by his own officers. The crisis ended almost as quickly as it began, but it had revealed how fragile Marcus's hold on power truly was, how quickly loyalty could shift when an emperor seemed weak or absent. All of these disasters, personal and political and military, accumulated like weights on Marcus's shoulders. The plague that wouldn't end, the wars that couldn't be won decisively, the children dead, the wife dead, the co-emperor dead, the endless demands for decisions, each one a choice between bad options. Spend money on the military and let the people suffer. Spend on relief and leave the borders undermanned. Execute potential traitors and rule through fear. Show mercy and invite more rebellion. There were no good answers, only the least bad choices, made day after day, year after year. By 172, when Marcus established his headquarters at Carnuntum for what would become a long winter campaign, he had been dealing with continuous crises for more than a decade. He was 51 years old. His health was poor. His body was failing. His spirit was under assault from every direction. And yet, he could not quit, could not lay down the burden, could not escape into the philosophical life he had always wanted. Duty demanded that he stay, that he continue, that he find some way to keep going, even when everything in him wanted to stop. This was the context in which Marcus began to write what would become the Meditations. Not in peaceful gardens or quiet libraries, but in military camps. In the pre-dawn hours before the day's duties began. In the late evenings after conferences with generals and reports from scouts. In snatched moments of privacy when he could close the door to his quarters and be alone with his thoughts. He wrote in Greek, not Latin, perhaps because that was the language of philosophy, the language in which he had first encountered Stoic ideas. He wrote for himself, not for any audience. The notes were reminders, exercises, spiritual practices designed to help him maintain his equilibrium in circumstances that would break most people. The writing was a lifeline, a way to process the impossible burden he carried, a way to practice the philosophy he believed in but found so hard to live, a way to talk himself through the darkness, reminding himself of principles that logic could affirm, even when emotion screamed in protest. Night after night, he sat with stylus and wax tablet, or ink and papyrus, working through the fundamental questions. Why am I suffering? What is within my control? What must I accept? How can I maintain virtue when the world demands I do terrible things? How can I find peace when there is no peace to be found? The answers he found were not easy ones. They did not promise that things would get better, or that his burdens would lighten, but they offered something else. A way to carry what must be carried. A way to be at peace with war. Not by pretending the war wasn't happening, not by numbing himself to the horror of it, but by understanding what he could control and what he could not. By accepting what is, rather than raging against what cannot be changed. By finding freedom not in external circumstances, but in the fortress of his own mind. This was the work he was engaged in on that winter night at Carnuntum, the night when something shifted, when the practice of philosophy finally delivered what it had promised, when Marcus Aurelius found the peace he had been seeking all along, a military camp on the edge of the world. Carnuntum was not Rome. It was not even a proper city, though a civilian settlement had grown up around the military fortress over the decades. It was a frontier outpost, a base of operations for legions tasked with defending the Danube line against an enemy that lived just across the river. The fortress itself was built of timber and earth, not stone. The buildings were functional, designed for utility rather than comfort. The commander's quarters, where Marcus lived, were certainly better than the common soldiers' barracks, but they were still Spartan by the standards of the imperial palace. Cold in winter, hot in summer, damp when it rained, and it rained often in Pannonia. This was where the most powerful man in the world made his home for years on end. The daily routine of a military camp begins before dawn. Sentries are changed, fires are stoked, soldiers emerge from their tents and barracks, stamping feet against the cold, breath visible in the winter air. Commands are shouted. Formations assembled for morning inspection and assignment of duties. The rhythms are ancient, proven over centuries of Roman military practice. Everyone knows their role. Everyone performs their function. It is a machine designed to project power and maintain order in a world that tends toward chaos. For Marcus, mornings meant councils of war with his generals, reports from scouts about enemy movements, discussions of supply lines and reinforcements, decisions about when to campaign and when to hold position. The Germanic tribes did not fight according to Roman conventions. They did not form up in neat battle lines for set-piece engagements. They raided, they ambushed, they struck where the Romans were weak and vanished when the legions assembled against them. Countering this required constant vigilance, flexibility, and intelligence gathering. It required understanding, not just military tactics, but the political dynamics of the tribal confederation, knowing when to negotiate and when to fight, when to offer terms and when to demand unconditional surrender. Marcus was not a natural military commander. He had been trained in rhetoric and philosophy, not strategy and tactics. But he learned. He listened to experienced officers like Pompeianus. He studied the geography and the enemy. He made mistakes, certainly, and those mistakes cost lives, which haunted him. But he also achieved successes, enough to keep the frontier from collapsing entirely, enough to maintain Roman control, if not Roman dominance. It was slow, grinding work, without the glory of great victories but essential for the survival of the empire. Afternoons brought administrative duties. The empire did not stop functioning because the emperor was on campaign. Petitions had to be reviewed, legal cases decided, governors appointed, tax policies set, diplomatic correspondence answered. All of this had to happen, even while managing a war. Marcus had staff to help him, secretaries and legal experts, and officials who could handle routine matters. But the important decisions, the ones that would set precedents, or commit resources, or determine policy, those fell to him. And he took them seriously, perhaps too seriously, reading every document carefully, considering every implication. It exhausted him. But it was his duty, and duty was everything. Evenings were when Marcus could finally be alone. When the day's obligations were met and the camp had settled for the night, he would retreat to his quarters. There was a simple bed, a desk, a few chairs, a brazier for heat and light. Books, precious in that time and place, scrolls containing the works of Stoic philosophers. His journal, growing page by page. This was his refuge, the only space that was truly his own. The conditions were harsh by any standard. The winter cold penetrated everything. Even with a fire burning, the room was never truly warm. Wind whistled through gaps in the timber walls. Frost formed on the inside of windows. Marcus suffered from chronic health problems that the cold made worse. We don't know exactly what ailments he had, but ancient sources mention stomach pains, possibly ulcers. He may have taken opium-based medication for pain, which was common in that era. Some modern scholars have speculated that the imagery in parts of the meditations, particularly the more apocalyptic passages, might reflect the effects of this medication, but we cannot know for certain. What we do know is that he was often in physical pain, that his body was failing him even as his responsibilities demanded more than he could give. The food would have been standard military rations: grain porridge, bread, salted meat when available, vegetables when in season, wine cut with water. Nothing like the elaborate feasts of Rome, where multiple courses showcase the empire's wealth and the chef's skill. For an emperor living in camp, the fare was likely better than common soldiers received, but still simple by palace standards. Marcus ate to survive, not for pleasure, and often, given his stomach problems, eating itself was uncomfortable. Yet another small misery added to the larger ones. Sleep was irregular and often interrupted. A commander must always be ready to respond to emergencies. An enemy attack on the perimeter, a fire in the camp, a messenger arriving with urgent news from Rome, or another frontier. Marcus trained himself to wake quickly and think clearly, even when malakat from deep sleep. It was a necessary skill, but one that prevented true rest. He was tired all the time, with a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. It was the tiredness of carrying too much for too long, with no prospect of relief. And always, there was the knowledge that men were dying because of his decisions. This was perhaps the heaviest burden. Marcus believed in the Stoic principle that a good person must serve the community, must fulfill their role in the larger order of things. For him, that role was emperor, and being emperor meant sending men to fight and die. It meant ordering executions when military discipline demanded it. It meant making calculations about acceptable losses. Every general must do this, but for a philosopher who believed all human beings were part of a universal brotherhood, who believed in the equal worth of every rational soul, it was agony. How do you reconcile the command, love humanity, with the order, attack that position, knowing some of your men won't return? How do you maintain virtue while doing what virtue seems to forbid? This was the contradiction at the heart of Marcus's life, and it was in the evening, in the quiet of his quarters, that he wrestled with it, not through abstract theorizing, but through the practice of writing, through the discipline of putting his thoughts on paper, examining them, testing them against Stoic principles, working towards some kind of understanding that would let him carry on. The camp around him was a world of men, soldiers, officers, servants, merchants who followed the army, prostitutes who serviced the soldiers, farriers and blacksmiths and carpenters, all the specialists required to keep an army functioning. It was loud during the day, full of the sounds of tens of thousands of people living in close proximity. Shouted orders, hammering from the workshops, the ring of weapons in training, the braying of pack animals. At night, the sounds diminished, but never ceased entirely. Sentries calling out to each other, the occasional disturbance from the civilian settlement outside the fortress walls, the crackling of fires, the howling of wind. But in his room, with the door closed, Marcus could create a bubble of silence. Or, if not true silence, at least a space where the external noise faded enough that he could hear his own thoughts. This was precious. This was necessary. Because the battle he fought each night was not against Germanic warriors, but against despair. Against the feeling that his life was not his own, that he was trapped in a role he had never chosen, doing things he had never wanted to do, with no escape and no end in sight. Most men in such circumstances would have broken. They would have turned to drink or other forms of escape. They would have become bitter, cruel, taking out their misery on those beneath them. Or they would have simply gone through the motions, performing their duties mechanically while dying inside. Marcus was in danger of all of these things. The meditations show moments of real darkness, passages where the weight of it all threatens to crush him, where he questions whether there's any point to continuing, where the universe seems indifferent or hostile, where human life appears meaningless, where virtue seems like a fool's game in a world governed by fortune and force. But he did not break. He found a way to carry on, and the method he found, the practice that kept him from falling into despair, was the nightly ritual of philosophical writing, of reminding himself who he wanted to be, of remembering the principles he believed in, of working through the fears and doubts and exhaustion until he could see clearly again, until the fog lifted enough that he could take up the burden for one more day. This was not easy. It did not come naturally. Every night was a struggle. Every page he wrote was wrested from the darkness that threatened to overwhelm him. But he kept doing it, night after night, month after month, year after year, because he had to, because there was no other choice. Because if he stopped, if he let go of philosophy and virtue and the attempt to live well, then he would become something he could not bear to be. He would become just another tyrant, just another man who ruled through power and died, having accomplished nothing that mattered. So Marcus sat at his desk, in the cold and the dark, and he wrote. He wrote to save himself. He wrote to find some way to make sense of his life. And somewhere during those winters at Carnuntum, likely between 172 and 175, something shifted through this constant practice. The philosophy he had studied since childhood became lived experience. The theory transformed into reality. Whether this happened in a single revelatory night or gradually across many nights of practice, the meditations show us a man who found the peace his circumstances would never provide. The practice of Stoicism in the darkness. The Stoicism that Marcus Aurelius practiced was not an academic exercise. It was a survival strategy, a set of mental and spiritual disciplines designed to help a person maintain their humanity in circumstances that strip away everything else. The word Stoic has come to mean emotionless, cold, detached from feeling. But that is a misunderstanding. The ancient Stoics did not seek to eliminate emotion. They sought to eliminate suffering caused by wrong judgment, to respond to events with reason rather than passion, to maintain inner freedom regardless of external constraint. The foundation of Stoic practice is the dichotomy of control. This principle, most clearly articulated by Epictetus but central to all Stoic thought, holds that some things are within our power and some things are not. What is within our power? Our judgments, our choices, our mental assent or rejection. What is not within our power? Everything else. Our bodies, our possessions, our reputation, other people's actions, the outcomes of events. The Stoics taught that all suffering comes from desiring what we cannot control or fearing what we cannot prevent. That freedom and peace come from focusing all our energy on what we can control and accepting with equanimity everything we cannot. This sounds simple. It is not. Every instinct screams against it. We want to control outcomes. We want our plans to succeed. We want people to behave as we wish. We want the world to conform to our desires. And when it doesn't, we suffer. We rage. We grieve. We exhaust ourselves trying to change what cannot be changed. The Stoic practice is to recognize this pattern and interrupt it, to catch ourselves in the act of demanding that reality be other than it is, to redirect our attention from what we cannot control to what we can. For Marcus, this meant accepting that he could not control whether the war was won or lost. He could not control whether the plague would end. He could not control whether the Senate supported him or plotted against him. He could not control the weather, the enemy's decisions, the outcome of battles. What he could control was how he responded to all of this, whether he maintained his virtue, whether he did his duty to the best of his ability, whether he treated people with justice and kindness, whether he kept his own mind free from corruption. Every evening, he practiced this principle through writing. He would review the day's events and examine his reactions to them. Had he gotten angry at a subordinate? That was a failure of control, letting someone else's actions determine his emotional state. Had he worried about the campaign's outcome? That was demanding certainty about the future, which is not ours to have. Had he resented his situation, wishing he could be back in Rome or living as a private citizen? That was refusing to accept what is, clinging to fantasies about what might have been. Page after page, he worked through these failures, not to punish himself, but to understand them, to see the pattern of wrong judgment that led to suffering, to practice seeing events correctly, according to their nature rather than his desires. Another key Stoic practice was negative visualization, or premeditatio malorum. This involved deliberately imagining the worst things that could happen, not as a form of worry or anxiety, but as a way of preparing oneself mentally and emotionally. Marcus would visualize his own death, the death of his children, which had already happened many times, the collapse of the empire, total military defeat, betrayal by those he trusted. By forcing himself to confront these possibilities in his imagination, he found they lost some of their power to terrify him. He could think clearly about them, plan for them if planning was possible, and accept them if they were inevitable. This practice might seem morbid or depressing, but Marcus found it liberating. When you have already accepted in your mind that the worst can happen, that everything you love can be taken away, that all your efforts can fail, you become harder to break. Not because you don't care, but because you've already done the grief work in advance. You've already faced the terror, and you've discovered that you can bear it, that even in the worst case, you still have your capacity to choose how to respond. You still have your mind, your reason, your ability to maintain virtue. And those things, the Stoics taught, are truly yours in a way that nothing external can ever be. Marcus also practiced the view from above, a technique of mentally stepping back from his immediate situation to see it in broader context. He would imagine himself rising above the military camp, above the Danube Valley, above the earth itself, looking down at the entire empire, then the entire world, then the cosmos. From that perspective, all his problems shrank. The war was a tiny disturbance on one continent of one planet in an infinite universe. His reign was a blink in time measured against eternity. His fears and ambitions and struggles were trivial compared to the vast movements of nature and history. This was not meant to make him feel insignificant in a crushing way. It was meant to provide perspective, to remind him that his job was not to control the cosmos, but to do his small part well, to be a good person in his corner of the world for his brief time alive. Nothing more, nothing less. The contemplation of death was constant in the meditations. Marcus reminds himself again and again that death is coming, that it could come today, that everything is temporary and will dissolve back into the elements from which it came. This was not meant to be depressing. It was meant to clarify priorities. When you remember that you will die, maybe soon, maybe today, you become less concerned with accumulating wealth or prestige. You stop wasting time on trivialities. You focus on what actually matters, which for the Stoics meant virtue, living according to reason and nature, serving the common good. Every morning, Marcus practiced a kind of meditation that appears repeatedly in the meditations. He would remind himself what kind of people he would encounter that day. They will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, surly. But all of this, he told himself, comes from ignorance. They act this way because they don't know what is truly good and truly evil. They pursue wealth and pleasure and power, which the Stoics classified as indifference. Things that are neither good nor bad in themselves. They avoid hardship and loss, not understanding that these things cannot harm the soul. Knowing this, Marcus told himself, he could not be angry with them. He could only pity them and try to help them if possible. And if not possible, he could simply endure their behavior without letting it disturb his peace. This practice of reframing how he saw other people's behavior was crucial. An emperor has enormous power over people. He can execute, he can exile, he can impoverish. Marcus could have responded to stupidity or malice with overwhelming force, but that would have corrupted his own character. So instead, he practiced seeing everyone, even the most annoying or hostile, as fellow members of the human family, as partners in the great work of reason, as people doing the best they could with the understanding they had, even when that best was very poor indeed. All of these practices, these exercises, were things Marcus did in the privacy of his quarters at night. No one watched. No one graded his performance. This was work he did for himself, on himself, because he believed it was necessary for living a good life. The meditations show us this work in process. They are not polished essays. They are raw notes, reminders, arguments he was making to himself to counteract destructive thoughts and emotions. Sometimes they repeat the same ideas over and over, which tells us these were the ideas he most needed to remember, the ones that were hardest to hold on to in the face of daily reality. Reading the meditations, you can feel the struggle. You can sense the darkness pressing in on him, the exhaustion, the grief, the fear. But you can also sense the discipline, the refusal to give in, the stubborn insistence that virtue matters and that he will not abandon it no matter what happens. Marcus is not pretending that everything is fine. He is not denying the difficulty of his situation. He is simply refusing to let that difficulty define him, refusing to let circumstances, however terrible, destroy his capacity to choose well. And on that winter night at Carnuntum, something crystallized. The practices that he had been performing mechanically, dutifully, because his philosophy said he should, suddenly became real. The theory became experience. The words he had been writing to himself became true in a way they had not been before. Marcus found what he had been seeking, not happiness, not relief from his burdens, but peace. The kind of peace that exists independently of circumstance. The kind that comes from perfect acceptance of what is, combined with perfect commitment to doing what virtue requires. A peace that the world cannot give and cannot take away. The night, everything changed. We cannot know the exact date. Marcus did not timestamp his entries in the meditations, but we know from the location notes that he wrote Book 2 at Carnuntum, suggesting a period between 172 and 175. The text itself shows no single moment of transformation, but rather the accumulated effect of disciplined practice over time. Yet the meditations do reveal a shift, a deepening of understanding that suggests somewhere during those brutal winters, theory became experience. Let us imagine what that process might have looked like, drawing from what the meditations themselves tell us. The camp is quiet as it ever gets. Most of the men are asleep, exhausted from the day's duties. The sentries pace their rounds, their breath steaming in the cold air. In the civilian settlement outside the fortress, a few lights still burn where merchants and camp followers go about their business. But in the commander's quarters, there is only the single lamp illuminating Marcus's desk, and the brazier glowing dull red. Marcus is tired, we can imagine. More than tired. He is 51 years old, which was old for that time. He has been emperor for more than a decade, most of it spent dealing with crises. His body hurts. His stomach troubles him. The pain, sharp enough to make concentration difficult. His eyes ache from reading and writing by inadequate light. Everything in him wants to give up, to go to bed, to escape into sleep and not think for a few hours. But he has trained himself in discipline. He has committed to this practice. So he sits, he picks up the stylus, and he begins to write. At first, it would have been the same as always. Reminders to himself about what is within his control and what is not. Observations about the nature of change and impermanence. Reflections on duty and virtue. The well-worn grooves of thought that he had traveled so many times before. But the meditation suggests that through this repetition, through this constant return to core principles, understanding deepened. What began as intellectual exercise became something more. He writes passages like, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." This thought appears repeatedly in the meditations because it represents the core principle of Stoicism, something he had known intellectually since he was a boy. But in the writing, in the constant repetition and examination, intellectual knowledge seems to have transformed into lived wisdom. He had been carrying the weight of the empire, the weight of the war, the weight of all his responsibilities and all his losses. He had been trying to control outcomes, to make things turn out right, to solve all the problems and fix all the disasters. And it had been crushing him because it was impossible. He could not control outcomes. He never could. No one can. But he could control his mind. He could control his judgments. He could control whether he responded to difficulty with virtue or with vice. He could choose to accept what is while still doing everything in his power to make things better. And in that acceptance, in that letting go of the demand that the world be other than it is, there was freedom. There was peace. Not the peace of getting what you want, but the peace of not needing anything to be different than it is. The war will continue. Men will keep dying. The plague will keep spreading. His health will keep failing. His children are gone and will not return. All of this is true. All of this is outside his control. And accepting that does not mean doing nothing. It means doing everything possible to fulfill his responsibilities while simultaneously not being destroyed by outcomes he cannot determine. It means maintaining inner freedom while accepting external constraint. It means being at peace with war. This is the paradox at the heart of Stoicism. You fight for what is right with all your strength, while simultaneously accepting that you might fail. You care deeply about people and their suffering, while recognizing that you cannot control whether they suffer. You take responsibility for your role, while acknowledging that you are not responsible for what others do or what fortune brings. You live fully engaged with the world, while maintaining a kind of detachment that protects your inner peace. Through his writing practice, Marcus worked through the implications of this understanding. The universe is change. Life is opinion. Meaning that the facts of the world are constantly shifting, but how we interpret those facts, the judgments we make about them, that is up to us. Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. Not denying that external things matter, but insisting that the most important thing, the condition of your own soul, is within your power. The hours of many such nights passed this way. The lamp would burn lower. Marcus would keep writing, working through ideas, examining his thoughts, refining his understanding. If nothing external can truly harm him, only his own vice, then he is invulnerable in the ways that matter most. If his happiness depends on his judgment rather than on outcomes, then he can be happy, or at least at peace regardless of circumstances. This does not mean he will not feel pain. His body still hurts. His heart still grieves his lost children. But those pains do not have to define him. They do not have to corrupt his character or destroy his peace. This understanding, cultivated through persistent practice rather than sudden revelation, sustained Marcus through 8 more years of war, through continued health problems, through the death of his wife in 175, through all the trials that remain. Because it was not conditional peace, dependent on things going well. It was unconditional peace, rooted in acceptance of what is and commitment to what virtue requires, a peace that the world could not give and could not take away. What peace actually meant to a Stoic. When we talk about peace, we usually mean the absence of conflict, the end of a war, the quiet after the storm, a state where threats have been neutralized and we can finally relax. But that is not what Marcus Aurelius meant when he wrote about finding peace. Stoic peace is something different, something that can exist even in the middle of war, even in the middle of suffering, even when everything external is going wrong. The Greek word the Stoics used was ataraxia, which is often translated as tranquility or equanimity. But it is more than just calmness. It is a state of profound inner stability, where you are not tossed about by changing circumstances, where you remain yourself, regardless of what happens to you. The Stoics believed this was possible because they believed that true harm can only come from within, that external events, no matter how terrible, cannot touch the essential you unless you let them. This idea seems almost absurd from a modern perspective. Of course, external events can harm us. We can be injured, impoverished, bereaved. We can lose everything we care about. How can philosophy claim that these things don't truly matter? But the Stoics were not denying that external events have effects. They were making a distinction between harm to the body and harm to the character, between damage to our circumstances and damage to our soul. And they insisted that the second type of harm, the moral or spiritual harm, only comes from our own choices. Only we can corrupt our own character through vice. Only we can destroy our own integrity through wrong action. For Marcus, this meant that the war could destroy his body, but not his virtue. The plague could kill him, but not corrupt him. Betrayal could cost him the throne, but not his self-respect. As long as he maintained his commitment to doing what was right, to living according to reason and nature, to serving the common good with justice and compassion, then the essential him remained intact, unconquered, free. This was the source of his peace. Not that nothing bad would happen. Bad things were happening constantly, but that the worst things, the things that truly matter, were within his control. This kind of peace requires a radical reorientation of values. The Stoics taught that there were only 3 categories of things: good, bad, and indifferent. The good consisted solely of virtue, of excellence of character. The bad consisted solely of vice. Everything else, all the things we normally care about most, wealth, health, reputation, success, long life, these were classified as indifference. Not that they did not matter at all. The Stoics acknowledged that some indifferents were preferable to others. Health is preferable to sickness. Wealth is preferable to poverty. But these preferences are not absolute. They can be rationally overridden. It is better to be poor and virtuous than wealthy and vicious. Better to die with integrity than live in shame. When Marcus fully internalized this value hierarchy, it freed him. He could still do everything in his power to end the war, to stop the plague, to protect his people. These were preferable outcomes, but their achievement or failure did not determine his worth or his peace. His worth came from trying to do what was right. His peace came from accepting that outcomes were not fully within his control. He could fight with all his strength and still lose. And that loss, however devastating in practical terms, would not be a moral failure as long as he had acted virtuously. This is a hard teaching. Most of us define ourselves by our achievements and our failures. We feel like good people when things go well, and bad people when they go badly. We internalize outcomes as reflections of our worth. The Stoics were asking Marcus to let go of that entirely, to separate who he was from what happened to him, to find his identity not in his role as emperor or his success as a military commander, but in his character, in the choices he made moment by moment about how to respond to whatever arose. Another aspect of Stoic peace was the acceptance of necessity. The Stoics believed that the universe operates according to rational laws, that everything that happens for a reason, as part of a larger whole. They called this providence, or nature, or the logos, depending on the text. Modern people might be more comfortable calling it causality or the laws of physics. The specific terminology matters less than the core idea, that what happens is what had to happen given all the preceding causes. That we live in a deterministic universe where events unfold according to natural law. This might sound like it would lead to passivity. If everything is determined, why do anything? But the Stoics did not draw that conclusion. They believed that human choice is part of the causal chain, that our actions matter and have effects. But they also believed that many things are determined by factors beyond our control. The weather, other people's choices, accidents and diseases. These things happen because of causes we did not set in motion and cannot change. Fighting against them, raging at the universe for being what it is. This is irrational and makes us suffer without changing anything. So the Stoic practice is to distinguish between what we can influence and what we cannot, to put all our effort into what is within our power while accepting with grace what is not. This is sometimes called the serenity prayer approach, though that prayer came 2 millennia after Marcus. Changing what can be changed, accepting what cannot, and having the wisdom to know the difference. For Marcus, this meant accepting that the Germanic tribes would keep attacking because they were being pressured by migrations and needed land, that the plague would continue until it burned itself out, that people would act according to their nature and their understanding, which he could try to educate, but could not control. Fighting against these realities was exhausting and futile. Accepting them allowed him to focus his energy on what he could actually do, command his troops as well as possible, make the best decisions with the information available, maintain his own virtue regardless of outcomes. These things were within his power, and doing them to the best of his ability was enough, had to be enough, because it was all that was possible. The peace Marcus found was also deeply connected to the present moment. The Stoics taught that the past is gone and the future is uncertain. The only time that actually exists is now. So they practiced staying present, attending fully to what was in front of them, rather than being lost in regrets about the past or anxieties about the future. Marcus writes about this repeatedly. The present moment is all we have. It is the only place where we can exercise our reason and our virtue. Dwelling on what has already happened changes nothing. Worrying about what might happen is borrowing trouble from a future that may never arrive. So the task is to be fully engaged with now, to do what now requires, to respond to what is actually happening, rather than what we fear might happen or wish had happened. This present-centered awareness is another form of peace. When you are fully in the moment, not split between past and future, there is a kind of stillness. Not the stillness of inaction, but the stillness of focused attention. Athletes sometimes call this being in the zone. Everything else falls away. There is only the action you are taking, the choice you are making, the moment you are in. And in that focus, there is no room for anxiety or regret, only action. The peace Marcus found at Carnuntum was all of these things. Acceptance of what could not be controlled. Reorientation of values around virtue rather than outcomes. Recognizing necessity and working with it rather than against it. Staying present rather than being lost in past or future. And most fundamentally, the realization that he had the power, always had the power, to choose his response to anything that happened. That no circumstance could take away his freedom to maintain his character. That his peace depended on nothing external. That it was his to keep or lose, based entirely on his own judgments and choices. This was not a peace that made the war easier. It did not reduce the pain of his ulcer or bring back his dead children. It did not end the plague or defeat the enemy. What it did was allow him to carry on, to keep doing his duty without being crushed by it, to face each day, not with dread, but with equanimity, to accept that he might fail, might die, might see everything he worked for fall apart, and still maintain his commitment to virtue. And in that commitment, in that refusal to be corrupted or broken, there was a victory that no military defeat could take away. The tools he used to find it. Peace, in the Stoic sense, is not something that happens to you. It is something you build through practice. A skill developed over time through the repeated application of specific techniques. Marcus Aurelius had been studying these techniques since he was a boy, but it took years of hard practice before they became truly effective, before they transformed from theoretical knowledge to lived experience. The meditations show us the tools he used, the exercises he practiced night after night to maintain his equilibrium in circumstances that would destroy most people. The first and most fundamental tool was the discipline of judgment. The Stoics taught that events themselves are neutral. What makes them good or bad is the judgment we place on them. If I lose money, that is just a fact. It becomes bad only when I judge it as terrible, catastrophic, a disaster. If I maintain the Stoic perspective that money is an indifferent, something preferable but not necessary for my virtue or happiness, then the loss is just a change in circumstance, not a tragedy. This sounds simple, but it requires constant vigilance. Our minds automatically add judgments to events. We see something happen and instantly label it good or bad based on whether it serves our desires. The Stoic practice is to catch that automatic judgment before it solidifies, to pause and examine it, to ask, is this truly bad? Or is it just something I would have preferred to avoid? Marcus practiced this constantly. When he received news of a military setback, instead of immediately judging it as catastrophic, he would examine the facts. What actually happened? What are the real consequences? What is within my power to change about the situation? By stripping away the emotional judgment and looking at the bare facts, he could respond more rationally, make better decisions, avoid the panic or despair that comes from seeing every setback as the end of the world. Another key tool was the contemplation of death. Marcus writes about this so frequently in the Meditations that it can seem morbid. But for the Stoics, thinking about death was not depressing. It was clarifying. When you remember that you will die, that this life is temporary and could end at any moment, you stop wasting time on trivialities. You focus on what actually matters. You become less attached to outcomes because you know that in the long run, in the span of eternity, none of this will matter. The universe will continue. New people will arise. Your victories and defeats, your glories and humiliations, will all fade into the same indifference. This might sound nihilistic, but Marcus found it liberating. If nothing ultimately matters, then he could not ruin his life by making a wrong decision. The pressure was off. He could do his best, try to choose wisely, act virtuously. But the cosmic importance of his choices was not as great as his anxiety suggested. This freed him to act without being paralyzed by the weight of responsibility. Yes, his decisions affected millions of people. Yes, mistakes had terrible consequences. But in the grand scheme of things, in the vast indifference of the cosmos, his reign was a tiny moment. This perspective took the sting out of failure and the intoxication out of success. Both were temporary. Both were less important than they seemed. The exercise of turning the obstacle upside down was another crucial tool. The Stoics believed that obstacles could be opportunities, that difficulty could build character, that what appeared to be bad fortune could actually be good for your development. Marcus practiced reframing every setback this way. The war is an opportunity to practice courage. The plague is a chance to practice compassion and resourcefulness. Incompetent subordinates are a practice in patience and teaching. Enemies are practice in justice and mercy. Nothing is purely negative if you can find the opportunity in it. Not because you're glad it happened, but because you refuse to let it be only a burden. You extract from it whatever good can be found. This reframing is not denying reality or pretending things are fine when they are not. It is actively looking for ways to grow from difficulty. And in that search, finding that even the worst experiences can serve your development if you let them. Marcus was not happy about the war, but he could recognize that it was making him stronger, forcing him to develop capacities he might never have cultivated in easier circumstances. And that growth, that development of character, was genuinely valuable in a way that comfort never could be. The practice of gratitude was also central to Marcus's mental discipline. Every day, he would list things he was grateful for. He devoted the entire first book of the Meditations to this exercise, thanking the people who had taught him important lessons. His grandfather for modeling dignity, his mother for piety and generosity, his tutors for wisdom, Antoninus Pius for showing him what a good emperor could be. This was not Pollyanna positivity, pretending everything was wonderful. It was an intentional focus on what was good in his life, despite all the difficulties, training his mind to notice the gifts he had received rather than only the burdens he carried. This practice of gratitude served multiple purposes. It reminded him that he was not alone, that he stood on the shoulders of those who had taught and helped him. It cultivated humility, recognizing how much he owed to others, and it balanced the negativity bias that all humans have, the tendency to focus on threats and problems while overlooking goods and supports. By deliberately calling to mind what he was grateful for, Marcus prevented himself from sinking into a pit of despair where nothing seemed good or worth preserving. The technique of cosmic perspective, or the view from above, was another tool Marcus used regularly. He would imagine himself rising above his situation, seeing it from greater and greater distance. First above the camp, then above the province, then the empire, then the earth, then the solar system, then the galaxy. From that cosmic vantage point, all his problems shrank to insignificance. The war was a tiny conflict on one planet, in one solar system, in one of billions of galaxies. His life was an eye blink in a universe billions of years old. This was not meant to make him feel worthless. It was meant to provide perspective, to remind him that his job was not to save the universe, but to do his small part well. that he was one node in a vast network, important in his place but not the center of everything. This cosmic perspective helped Marcus let go of the grandiose ego that comes with being emperor. It is easy, when everyone around you treats you as the most important person in the world, to start believing it, to think that your desires should reshape reality, that your will should be done. The view from above countered this. It reminded Marcus that he was part of something much larger than himself, that the universe did not revolve around him, that his role, however important to the people he served, was ultimately a small one in the grand scheme of things. And that was okay. He could serve well in his small role without needing to be cosmically significant. Finally, Marcus practiced negative visualization, the exercise of imagining loss. He would deliberately picture the death of people he loved, the loss of his position, the defeat of his armies, the collapse of everything he was working for. This was not pessimism, it was preparation. By confronting these possibilities in advance, in imagination, he reduced their power to devastate him if they actually happened. He had already done the grief work, already faced the terror, and found that he could bear it. That even in the worst case, he would still have his capacity to choose how to respond, still have his virtue, which no external circumstance could take away. All of these tools, these practices, these exercises, Marcus used not once, but repeatedly. They appear again and again in the meditations because he needed to practice them again and again. This was not knowledge you acquire once and keep forever. It was a skill that required constant training. The mind naturally falls back into unhelpful patterns, into demanding that reality be different, into judging events as catastrophic, into losing perspective and focusing only on immediate threats. So Marcus had to remind himself constantly of the truth, had to practice seeing things rightly, had to exercise his philosophical muscles every day, or risk losing the strength he had built. The meditations are the record of that practice. They show us a man using philosophy as it was meant to be used, not as abstract theory, but as practical tool, as mental discipline, as spiritual exercise, as the means to find and maintain peace even when circumstances offered none. And they show us that it worked, not perfectly. Marcus had bad days, moments of despair and anger that appear in the text. But overall, the practice sustained him, gave him what he needed to keep going, allowed him to find the peace that his circumstances would never provide. The wisdom that emerged from war. The meditations are not a systematic philosophical treatise. They are fragmented notes, reminders, exercises scattered across 12 books with no clear, organizing principle. But certain themes emerge with striking clarity, certain insights that Marcus returned to again and again because they were what he needed most. These are the distilled wisdom of a man learning to find peace in war, learning to maintain virtue in circumstances that push toward vice, learning to carry unbearable burdens without being crushed. One of the most frequent themes is impermanence. Everything changes. Everything passes. Nothing lasts. Marcus writes about this in 100 different ways, using metaphors from nature. A river that flows past and is gone. Smoke that disperses in the air. Waves that rise and fall on the ocean. He contemplates the ruins of ancient civilizations, the forgotten names of once powerful emperors, the way time reduces all human achievements to dust. This might seem depressing, but for Marcus, it was liberating. If nothing lasts, then the things he was afraid of losing were already temporary. The things he was striving for would not endure. This put his struggles in perspective, made them less absolute, less all-consuming. But impermanence also meant that difficult times would pass, that the current crisis was not permanent, that enduring it was possible because it would end. The war would end, either in victory or defeat, or negotiated peace. The plague would burn out eventually. His own life would end, which meant his suffering would end. Not through escape, but through the natural working out of time. Everything that begins also ends. This was simply the nature of things. Fighting against it was futile. Accepting it allowed him to endure without bitterness. Another central theme is the interconnectedness of all things. Marcus writes frequently about how human beings are social animals, designed by nature to work together, how we are all part of one community, one commonwealth of rational beings, how what harms the whole harms each part, and what benefits the whole benefits each part. This was not just abstract philosophy, it was the foundation for his ethics. If we are all connected, all part of one larger organism, then serving others is serving ourselves. Harming others is harming ourselves. The old division between selfish and altruistic action breaks down. What is good for the community is good for the individual, because the individual is not separate from the community. This insight helped Marcus navigate the terrible moral dilemmas of war. How could he justify sending men to their deaths? How could he order the destruction of enemy villages, knowing that women and children would suffer? The Stoic answer was that he was acting for the common good, that the empire, with all its flaws, provided order and civilization, that defending it was defending the possibility of rational human community, that allowing it to fall to barbarian invasions would lead to greater suffering. These were not comfortable answers. Marcus knew he was making calculations about lives and deaths, trading some people's welfare for others, but the framework of interconnectedness at least gave him a principle to work from. He was not just pursuing his own glory or protecting his own power. He was serving the larger whole of which he was a part. The theme of duty appears constantly. Marcus reminds himself that he has a role to play, that he was born for this, or if not born for it, at least called to it by circumstance. That complaining about his responsibilities is like a hand complaining that it has to grasp, or a foot complaining that it has to walk. It is simply the nature of things. His job was to be emperor, to lead the army, to make the decisions no one else could make. Wishing he could be something else was irrational. He was what he was, in the situation he was in, and the only meaningful question was how to do it well. This acceptance of duty was crucial to Marcus's peace. A large part of his suffering came from resisting his role, from wishing he could be a private philosopher rather than a public emperor, from longing for the quiet life he had never been allowed to live. But that longing was itself a source of pain. It made the present feel like a theft, like time being stolen from the life he should have had. When Marcus fully accepted that this was his life, that there was no other life waiting for him, that his duty was what he had been given to do, the resentment faded. He could throw himself fully into the role because he had stopped wishing it were different. The concept of logos, of reason or rational principle, structures much of the meditations. Marcus believed that the universe operates according to reason, that there is an underlying order to things, even when that order is not apparent to us. This did not mean everything happens for a purpose in the sense that a loving God orchestrates events for our benefit, but it did mean that events have causes, that the world makes sense, even when we cannot see the sense of it, and that our task as rational beings is to align ourselves with that cosmic reason, to live according to nature, which means according to our nature as rational, social creatures. This trust in cosmic reason helped Marcus endure what he could not understand. Why did the plague happen now? Why did the Germanic invasions come when the empire was already weakened? Why did so many children die while terrible people lived? He could not answer these questions. but he could trust that they had answers, that the universe was not random chaos but ordered cosmos. And in that trust, he found a kind of peace. Not the peace of understanding everything, but the peace of accepting that understanding is not necessary, that his job is to play his part well, not to comprehend the whole drama. The relationship between thought and suffering is another key insight. Marcus repeatedly reminds himself that his suffering comes not from events, but from his judgments about events, that he is disturbed not by things, but by his opinions about things. This idea, central to all Stoic teaching, is also central to modern cognitive behavioral therapy. Our thoughts create our emotions. Change the thoughts, change the emotions. See events differently, feel differently about them. This does not mean we can think away all pain. Physical pain, grief, fear, these are natural responses to real threats and losses. But much of our suffering is optional, created by the stories we tell ourselves about what is happening. Marcus practiced catching those stories. When he found himself in despair, he would examine the thoughts creating the despair. Often they were catastrophic predictions that might not come true, or they were demands that reality be other than it is, or they were comparisons between what he had and what he wished he had. By examining these thoughts, questioning them, replacing them with more accurate and rational ones, he could reduce his suffering, even when he could not change his circumstances. The value of the present moment appears throughout the meditations. Marcus writes that life is not long in terms of years, but infinitely long in terms of moments, that we always have the present, that the present is all we ever have or ever will have. Past is memory, future is imagination, but now is real. And now, any given now, is bearable. We can endure this moment. Even if we could not endure a lifetime of such moments, we can endure this one, and then the next, and then the next. By focusing on the immediate present, on doing what this moment requires, Marcus avoided being overwhelmed by the accumulated weight of past failures and future fears. This present moment focus is perhaps the most practical of all the wisdom in the meditations. It is the one that anyone can apply immediately. When anxiety about the future threatens to overwhelm you, ask, what is this moment demanding? Not tomorrow, not next year, but right now. Usually, the answer is simple. Breathe, stand up, take the next step, do the next thing, and that is enough. That is all we ever have to do. The next thing, then the next, then the next. And in that focus on immediate action, the paralysis of overwhelming anxiety dissolves. All of this wisdom emerged not from comfortable reflection, but from desperate practice. Marcus was not philosophizing in the abstract. He was trying to survive emotionally and spiritually while carrying burdens that would crush most people. Every insight in the meditations was hard-won, forged in the fire of actual suffering, tested against real difficulties. This is what gives the book its enduring power. These are not theories about how to live well. These are tools that actually worked for someone living in the worst possible circumstances. And because they worked for him, there is hope that they might work for us, too. Why his peace still matters. Marcus Aurelius died on March 17th, 180, at a military camp near Vindobona, modern Vienna. The cause is uncertain, possibly the plague, which was still ravaging the empire, possibly complications from his chronic health problems, possibly simple exhaustion. He was 58 years old. He had been emperor for 19 years. He had spent the last decade of his life at war, living in camps on the frontier, fighting an enemy that could never be decisively defeated, and according to the accounts we have, he died as he had lived, calmly, with dignity, accepting what was coming without complaint or panic. His final words, according to one account, were directed to a guard. "Go to the rising sun, for I am already setting." Whether these were his exact words or a later embellishment, the sentiment reflects the Stoic acceptance of nature's processes that characterized his philosophy, the recognition that his time was ending and a new time beginning, the refusal to cling desperately to life or rage against the dying of the light. He had prepared for this moment through countless meditations on death, and when it came, the sources suggest he faced it with the same calm dignity he had cultivated throughout his reign. Marcus was immediately deified, which was standard practice for emperors. His ashes were returned to Rome and placed in Hadrian's mausoleum. Statues and monuments were erected in his honor. But his real legacy was not in stone or ritual. It was in the private journal he had kept during those years of war, the journal that had never been meant for publication. That had simply been his way of maintaining his sanity and his virtue in circumstances that tested both to the breaking point. How the meditations survived is something of a mystery. Marcus had not published them. There is no indication he even showed them to others. But somehow, they were preserved, copied, circulated. They appear in historical records by the 10th century at the latest. And once they were discovered by wider audiences, they became one of the most influential books in Western philosophy. Not because they proposed new theories, not because they systematized Stoic thought more clearly than earlier authors, but because they showed what that thought looked like when applied by a real person in desperate circumstances. The peace Marcus found at Carnuntum matters today because people still face impossible burdens, still find themselves in situations where they have responsibility without control, where they must do jobs they never wanted, where they carry weights that threaten to crush them. The specific circumstances change. Few of us are emperors dealing with plague and barbarian invasions, but we have our own equivalents. Caregivers watching loved ones decline. Leaders navigating crises they did not create and cannot solve. Anyone trying to maintain their integrity in a corrupt system. Anyone doing work that exhausts them because someone has to do it and they are the one who showed up. For all of these people, the meditations offer something vital, not escape from difficulty, not a promise that things will get better, but a method for carrying what must be carried, a way to maintain peace, not by changing circumstances, but by changing relationship to circumstances. The fundamental Stoic insight that Marcus embodied is as relevant now as it was 2,000 years ago. We do not control what happens to us, but we absolutely control how we respond. And in that response, in the choice to maintain virtue regardless of circumstance, there is a freedom and a peace that nothing external can take away. Modern psychology has rediscovered many of the principles Marcus practiced. Cognitive behavioral therapy teaches essentially the same thing the Stoics taught, that our thoughts create our emotions, that changing our thoughts changes our feelings, that much of our suffering is optional. Mindfulness practices teach present moment awareness, the same focus on now that Marcus emphasized. Acceptance and commitment therapy teaches exactly what the name suggests. Accepting what cannot be changed while committing to values-based action. All of these contemporary approaches are, in a sense, rediscoveries of ancient wisdom. But the meditations offer something that clinical psychology often does not: a complete philosophy of life. Not just techniques for managing anxiety or depression, but a framework for understanding what it means to live well. For Marcus, that meant living according to nature and reason. It meant recognizing our interconnectedness with all of humanity and acting accordingly. It meant accepting impermanence and death. It meant focusing on virtue, the one thing truly within our power, rather than on outcomes we cannot control. This is a complete vision of human flourishing, not just symptom management. In an age of increasing anxiety and depression, when many people feel overwhelmed by forces beyond their control, when the news is a constant stream of crisis and catastrophe, Marcus's example is particularly relevant. He faced genuine crises, real catastrophes, and he did not break. Not because he had it easy, not because he was superhuman, but because he had a practice, a discipline, a set of tools he used every day to maintain his equilibrium, and those tools are available to anyone. You do not need to be emperor to benefit from Stoic philosophy. You just need to be human, to face difficulties, to want to respond to them with virtue rather than vice. The specific peace Marcus found, the realization that he had power over his mind and not outside events, is perhaps more important now than ever. We live in a time when we are constantly reminded of things we cannot control. Global events, economic forces, political dysfunction, climate change, technological disruption. It is easy to feel powerless, to feel that individual action does not matter, to sink into learned helplessness. But Marcus reminds us that we always have control over the one thing that matters most, our own choices, how we treat others, whether we act with integrity, whether we do our duty, whether we maintain our virtue. These things are within our power, always, and they are enough. This does not mean we should not try to change the world. Marcus did not simply accept the Germanic invasions. He fought them. He tried to protect the empire and its people, but he fought without attaching his peace to victory. He could fight with all his strength, while simultaneously accepting that he might lose. And in that acceptance, paradoxically, he found the freedom to fight more effectively, because he was not paralyzed by fear of failure, not desperate to control outcomes, just committed to doing what virtue required and letting the results be what they would be. The relevance of Marcus's peace extends beyond individual mental health. It speaks to how we might approach collective challenges. How do we work for a better world without being destroyed by frustration when progress is slow or non-existent? How do we maintain hope when there are genuine reasons for despair? The Stoic answer is that we focus on what we can control, our own actions. We do what we can, as well as we can, for as long as we can. We recognize that we are part of something larger than ourselves, that our individual efforts contribute to a whole that we may never fully understand, and we make peace with the possibility that we might not see the fruits of our labor, that we might die before the problems are solved, that all our work might fail. This sounds pessimistic, but it is actually liberating. If we do not need to see results to justify our efforts, then we can act without being paralyzed by doubt. If our peace does not depend on success, then failure cannot destroy us. We can try, fail, get up, and try again. Not because we are certain of eventual success, but because trying is what virtue demands, and virtue is its own reward. Marcus Aurelius was not perfect. The Meditations make clear that he struggled, that he got angry and had to remind himself to be patient, that he despaired and had to talk himself back from the edge, that maintaining his practice was hard, daily work. But that is precisely why his example is so valuable. He shows us that peace is possible, not for some ideal sage who has transcended all difficulty, but for ordinary struggling humans who are doing their best in terrible circumstances. And if he could find peace commanding armies during a plague, maybe we can find it too, in whatever our circumstances are. The night at Carnuntum, when Marcus found peace, was not the end of his struggles. He had 8 more years of war to endure, more losses to grieve, more impossible decisions to make. But something fundamental had shifted. He had found a way to carry what he had to carry, and that way, that practice, that philosophy, survived him. Survived the collapse of the empire he served, survived the Dark Ages and the medieval period and the modern era, came down to us across 2 millennia, because people in every generation recognized its truth, recognized that what worked for Marcus might work for them too. The legacy of one night. The story of Marcus Aurelius is not a happy story in the conventional sense. It is not a story of triumph over adversity or of dreams achieved. It is the story of duty fulfilled under the worst possible circumstances, of a man who never wanted to be emperor learning to be a good emperor, of a philosopher forced to be a warrior finding a way to reconcile those roles, of someone carrying impossible burdens without being destroyed by them. But in that story, there is something profoundly hopeful. If Marcus could find peace in war, if he could maintain his virtue while making terrible decisions, if he could live with integrity while surrounded by compromise and corruption, then perhaps the rest of us can find ways to navigate our own difficult circumstances. Perhaps the peace we seek is not contingent on things going well. Perhaps it is available right now, in the middle of whatever chaos we are currently experiencing, if we are willing to do the work of changing how we relate to that chaos. The wisdom Marcus distilled in the Meditations is practical, accessible, and immediately applicable. You can start practicing Stoic principles today, right now. You can begin distinguishing between what is within your control and what is not. You can practice catching your judgments before they solidify into suffering. You can contemplate impermanence and death as a way of clarifying priorities. You can work on maintaining present moment awareness rather than being lost in past regrets or future fears. You can commit to virtue regardless of outcomes. None of this requires special circumstances or rare abilities. It just requires practice. Consistent, daily practice. And if you do practice, if you apply these principles to your own life, you may find what Marcus found. Not that your circumstances magically improve, not that your burdens lighten, but that you develop a capacity to carry them, that you find a kind of peace that is independent of whether things are going well or poorly, that you become, in the Stoic sense, invulnerable. Not because nothing can hurt you, but because the things that truly matter, your character and your choices, are within your power to protect. The night at Carnuntum, whenever exactly it was just one night in a life full of difficult nights. Marcus would have many more before his death, but that night was when theory became practice, when intellectual understanding became lived experience, when he found what philosophy had been promising all along, a peace that the world cannot give and cannot take away, a fortress of the mind that remains standing even when everything external collapses. And the record he kept of that discovery, the journal we call the Meditations, has helped countless people across the centuries find their own version of that peace. We do not know what will happen in the years ahead, what challenges we will face individually and collectively, what burdens we will be asked to carry. But we can know, because Marcus showed us, that it is possible to carry them. That peace is possible even in the middle of war. That virtue can be maintained even when circumstances demand terrible compromises. That we have more strength than we know, more resources than we think, more capacity for endurance than we imagine. All of this is available to us if we are willing to do the work, to practice, to train our minds as Marcus trained his, to find in philosophy not abstract theory but practical wisdom for living well, regardless of circumstance. So here is the invitation that Marcus extends across the centuries, the invitation to stop demanding that the world be other than it is, to accept what cannot be changed, to focus all your energy on what you can control, which is fundamentally just your own choices, to find freedom, not in external circumstances, but in the fortress of your own mind, to maintain virtue regardless of outcomes, to be at peace with war, with suffering, with all the difficulties that life inevitably brings, not because you are indifferent to them, but because you have found something deeper than circumstance, something that remains steady when everything else shifts, the peace that comes from living according to reason and nature, the peace that Marcus found on a winter night at Carnuntum, the peace that is still available to anyone willing to seek it. And if you find this helpful, if this journey into the life and wisdom of Marcus Aurelius has given you something to think about, something to work with in your own struggles, then I invite you to like this video, to subscribe to the channel. Not because I need the numbers, but because it tells the algorithm to show these stories to more people who might need them. To share this with someone who is carrying a heavy burden. To leave a comment about where you are in the world, what time it is where you are listening, what burdens you are working to carry. Because we are all in this together, all trying to find peace in the middle of our various wars, all seeking some way to navigate the darkness. Marcus Aurelius went to his death as he had lived, calmly, with dignity, having done his duty, having maintained his virtue, having found, in the worst circumstances imaginable, a peace that sustained him to the end. His empire fell, his statues crumbled, his name became a footnote in history texts. But the peace he found survived. The practice he developed endures. The wisdom he recorded speaks to us still. And it invites us to find what he found, to build what he built, to discover that peace is not something the world gives us. It is something we create within ourselves through right thinking and right action. And that is good news, because it means peace is always possible, always available, always within our power to find, no matter what is happening around us, no matter how dark the night, no matter how heavy the burden. The fortress of the mind remains, and within it, we can find what Marcus found. Not escape, not relief, but the one thing that truly matters, the ability to remain ourselves, to maintain our virtue, to choose well, regardless of what the world throws at us. And in that ability, that choice, that fortress, there is a peace that nothing can take away. Go to the rising sun. A new day is coming, and with it, the opportunity to practice, to choose well, to build your own fortress of the mind, to find your own peace in the middle of whatever war you are fighting. The wisdom is available, the tools are here. All that remains is to begin.